Yeah, she's like our board lady.
Oh, no, that's okay. Hi, everybody, we're gonna start now. Hi, everybody, where's the Zoom? I'm waving at the wrong thing. I'm like, it's fire standing waves in the video. When they show them at the flyer stands and they're waving, but they're waving it themselves, they're waving it instead of the camera, so I'll be that person.
Beth, you're not gonna be able to hear you on Zoom if you don't use the mic. Yeah, use the phone mic. Sorry.
Thank you. Joe is mic'd up, so do I have to do the? Okay. Okay. Okay, now I'm out of my comfort zone completely. All right. Is that good? I remember we had the rabbi visit where we were all covering our ears. I don't want to do that. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. To introduce myself, my name is Beth Sadoff. I am the co-chair of the Social Action Committee at Bethel, along with Debbie Waxpress. Tonight, the Social Action Committee, in conjunction with the Schwartz-Kurtz-Zeller Education Institute, informally known as Adult Ed, and the Social Action Committee are very excited to host Jo Ivester, who's going to speak with us tonight. About Jo, she is an author and a speaker. She focuses on LGBTQ and civil rights advocacy. A former college professor, Jo conducts workshops for employers, school administrators, and community groups regarding how to create a more inclusive environment. In addition to her talks with students, church and temple groups, and service organizations, Jo testifies before legislative and administrative bodies on proposed legislation and policies that impact the transgender community. Big issue these days, especially. Jo's award-winning books include The Outskirts of Hope from 2015, as well as the book she'll be talking about tonight, Once a Girl, Always a Boy, a family's memoir of a transgender journey. The book, Once a Girl, Always a Boy, looks at what it is like to have a transgender son in a world not quite ready to accept him. Jo describes her son's experiences going back to early childhood when he first showed signs of being transgender. By sharing these stories, Jo aims to help her audience become more comfortable with transgender individuals and challenges them to recognize the discrimination that the community faces. And I was asked to remind everybody that this program will be recorded this evening, the Zoom of it, so that people can watch it later. And with that, I am happy to present Jo.
Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you all for inviting me to join you tonight. Just a sound check, you can hear me.
They're not going to Zoom, Matthew. You need the microphone for Zoom.
Is it better if I hold this here?
It's not.
Okay, I have a feeling. Try number 2. Can you hear me with this?
I didn't think that was. I didn't think so either.
How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm just gonna snuggle up to the lectern. If I stand behind it, you won't be able to see me. So I'll fight my. What was that? No, I'll stand. I'll stand right next to it. Is this going to pick up Zoom? Can I just stay here? The folks on Zoom can hear me? So we need both. Okay.
We can hear her. The Zoom, that's going to the Zoom feed for whatever reason, but it's not going to the.
We can hear you.
All right. It's hard to tuck that into my belt when I'm with one hand. The gym is a dangerous place, so
I agree.
That's what's going on here. Let me start over now. My name is Jo Ivester. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you tonight. As you know, I'll be speaking about our own family's experience with a transgender son in a world not quite ready to accept transgender people. Some parts of our world are more accepting than others. We live in Texas. It's been a hard few years. Let me back up though, before I get into the sharing of stories. And I know most of you probably already know what it means to be transgender, but let me give you my working definition, because it does vary. In different contexts, people use it differently. For my family's purposes, taking my son's lead, following his lead, if you're transgender, it means that the gender you know yourself to be inside doesn't match the way you were identified at birth. And in my son's case, we welcomed him into the world as what we thought was our daughter, but he was always our son. When you're transgender, you may experience something called gender dysphoria, and that's that really uncomfortable feeling that a trans individual gets because of the disconnect between how the world sees them and how they know themselves to be. And it's serious. If you have gender dysphoria, it can lead to anxiety, it can lead to depression, it can lead to suicide ideation. So there's a need for people to understand. That's the what of what I'll be talking about, and it leads into the why. Because this is so important, it's important for people to understand, because with understanding, we will gain acceptance. And that's really what it's about. My son, if he were here, he would say that he is in a battle to have people understand that he's real. That in many cases, folks don't believe that being transgender is a real thing. And if you don't believe it's real, if you don't believe this is a genuine, authentic experience, then it becomes much easier to use being transgender as a political weapon, as we've seen done over and over and over in recent years. I'm sure you've all seen the headlines in the newspapers, in the magazines, on the TV, talk shows. It's been very, very hard on the trans community, which is why we're active and we speak out because we can. And especially I speak out as a mom, because even when people don't understand what it means to be transgender, people generally can connect with the mom's love for their kid. And so I try to meet people with where they are. And if that's what they can connect with me on, then that's where I'll start. But tonight we're going to start with some stories about our family, going back to Jeremy's childhood. And I'll share a little bit from the book as well, a couple of readings. But I'm going to first start with when Jeremy was only 4 years old, so yay tall, and I could still feel big standing next to him. So Jeremy was really happy as a 4-year-old. His circle of friends didn't care about what was under his clothing. He had a group of little guy friends that he did everything with. He played sports with them, he ran around with them at school and in the neighborhood and sleepovers, and it was a really idyllic kid existence. And then a new place opened up to give haircuts in our neighborhood, and they targeted little boys. That was part of their marketing idea. And all of Jeremy's little friends wanted to get their hair cut there. And they did. And so Jeremy says, I want to get my hair cut there. Well, Jeremy didn't have a little boy short haircut. Jeremy had hair down to his shoulders. So I called to see, is this okay? Can you cut girls' hair? Because I thought of Jeremy as a girl at that point. They said, sure, come on in. It's not what we say we do, but yeah, we can handle it. Well, they couldn't. The stylist was just delightful, wonderful person, great with kids, but could not cut longer hair. And it was getting worse and worse the more she tried to shape it. And finally I said to Jeremy, don't worry about it, darling, I'll fix it when we get home. And I had been cutting his big brother's hair for a while, and so I felt okay with that, but I didn't really know what I was getting into. We get home, I start cutting his hair, and I'm having the same trouble that the stylist did. I cut one side and then that's shorter than the other side, so I cut the other side, then that's shorter than the back, and so I cut back there. Well, before I knew it, I had given Jeremy a traditional little boy haircut. And it it was very short and trimmed around the ears, and he looked just like his big brother did. And he looked in the mirror, and he was so happy with that. I don't know whether it was my experience with decisions or whether it was that I could pick up on how he was feeling, but I just kept cutting until he saw himself in the mirror for the first time. What was really interesting about those, what happened the next day? He went to daycare, and little kids, the way they define who's a boy and who's a girl is by their name and by how long their hair is and how they dress. Well, Jeremy had a girl name, and he had the longer hair, and he dressed like a little boy, but we all called him a tomboy, and that's what his friends called him, that's what he called himself. Now, all of a sudden, he had the short hair, and his little friends were confused. And all day long, he told me, they were coming up to him and saying, wait, are you a boy or a girl? I said, well, what did you answer them? And he said, I didn't. And then he explained at 4 years old that he didn't answer them because he liked the idea that they might think he was a boy. Well, if I knew then what I know now, I would have been thinking, I wonder if my kid is transgender. And I would have gone to a pediatrician, a counselor at school, maybe a therapist who's experienced with gender-affirming care and treatment, and I would have gotten some advice and some help and some support. But we were clueless. And so I just kind of kept going with saying, my kid's a tomboy. And that was an opportunity lost because we couldn't give him the kind of support that he deserved, that all kids deserve. But despite that, he was still a really happy kid. Well, before puberty hit and his body started changing, he just would forget that he was different from his friends. And they were great, and they would invite him to sleepovers where it would be all the boys and him, and no one cared until the end of elementary school. Somewhere around 10 years old, we had a sleepover planned, and one of the moms called me ahead of time, the mom that was hosting, and said, your kid can't stay. Uninvited Jeremy from the party. And that was devastating. Jeremy lost his circle of friends. And that was just the beginning of it. Because once one mom said, you can't come, all the moms said, you can't come. And the moms may have been ahead of the kids in making that decision, but the kids started not wanting Jeremy around. And the boys rejected him, and he didn't fit in with the girls. So he was alone. I want to share with you some of his own words that are in the book about what it was like for him at that point in his life. And this is directly from the book, page 52, if you've got the book with you. But before I read, I want to say a couple of things. One is, what you're going to hear is much shorter than what's in the book. It's cut for this kind of aesthetic, so don't worry that I'm going to read on and on and on. But the other thing is that as I share with you some of the readings from the book, there's a difference in my use of names and pronouns. In the book, I refer to Jeremy as she, and as a girl, and by his birth name for the first half of the book until we get to the point in time where Jeremy said, I'm Jeremy, I'm a man, please use your pronouns. That was a huge decision to make, because in the advocacy community, you don't do that. You don't do someone's birth name. They have a phrase for it, the dead name. That name is dead to them. And you don't talk about that they used to be something else. Jeremy was always a boy, we just didn't know it. But my editor, when she first read through my early material, said, you know, Joe, I'm going to interrupt to ask here, I need to move back?
I'm sorry.
Is this going to work now? Okay. Uh, Is this better if I stay up here? Okay, I will do that. I feel so short when I do this. But anyways, my editor said, if you jump right in with saying he and him and using his name Jeremy and saying he's a boy, you've denied your readers the chance to come on the journey with you. And she wanted the readers to be able to do that. So I went to Jeremy, who said, I get that, I understand, and it's okay. And then I went to several friends in the advocacy community, and I asked them the same question. And they were split. Some of them said, I get it, and some of them said, you can't do that. And the ones who said you can't do that, when I explained the rationale, they said, well, what does Jeremy say? So it came back to Jeremy, who said, you know what, it's okay, I get why you're doing it. So that's what I did in the book. But in this kind of a setting, when we don't have the whole context, when I'm trying to bring you on the journey in 1 hour instead of a whole book, it doesn't feel right to me. And I would stumble over it if I were trying to refer to Jeremy as anything other than Jeremy. And I would feel like you weren't getting to know him. So as I'm reading, know that I've changed it from the book. And if you read the book, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. So the scenario here that I'm going to read from is Jeremy's at his middle school, and he played football. He was viewed as the only girl in the history of the school to play football through 8th grade. And when he did it, he got a lot of praise, saying, oh, you're showing that girls can do anything they want. And you're standing up for women's rights and women's lib. And he said, that's not why I'm playing. I'm playing because I love playing football and I feel like I belong with this team. Again, I didn't pick up on the signals because I didn't know. So Jeremy played on the football team, and here's what he had to say about it. When we're on the field and suited up, my teammates forget that I'm a girl. With my shoulder pads and helmet, I don't look any different from them, and we're all caught up in the game. But I feel left out because we're no longer friends off the field. I thought 6th grade was tough, but 7th grade is even worse when it comes to not fitting in. One day, as we were hanging out before practice, waiting for the coaches to show up, I walked up to a group of guys who were laughing together. When I got there, though, they went all quiet. Whatever they were talking about, they didn't want to discuss it in front of me. Maybe it was girls or their junk, but it made me really uncomfortable. So I climbed into the stands to sit alone, thinking, it's okay that they don't want me around. I can deal. But I couldn't. I couldn't make the feeling go away. My throat hurt and my chest tightened, and I felt isolated and deserted as I thought about how long it had been since I'd hung out with my teammates, like when we were little kids. I no longer had a social life. So starting in middle school, Jeremy was alone, and his body didn't feel right to him. He didn't want puberty to hit. His friends who were girls welcomed puberty, and they were eager with every change and talked about it excitedly. Jeremy was just so devastated by changes in his body that he couldn't stop and he couldn't control. And we didn't know it, but he went to bed every night hoping for some magic to occur that he'd wake up as a boy in the morning. We didn't know, so we couldn't help. What we saw was a happy kid, because what he did was throw himself into sports. He played every sport he possibly could. He kept playing football, he played basketball, he played soccer, he ran track, and he was good at all of it. And so he got a lot of praise for that. He joined the school band and played the snare drum and marched in the drum line. He was the president of the art club. We're looking at this kid saying, wow, they're doing everything that they need to do except studying. He didn't like that part of school. But that's a whole different story. But those years were really hard, and it was harder because we didn't know. And middle school, high school, they're tough for everyone, but they're even tougher when you're transgender. And they're even tougher when you don't have any adults in your life helping out, either because they don't understand or they understand but are not accepting. But Jeremy got through that, and he felt loved and accepted by his family. Just, we didn't know what we were accepting. We knew we loved our kids unconditionally. And then Jeremy started reading about and seeing videos about transgender people, and his first thought was, well, that can't be me. I'm okay. He would hear stories about people who were contemplating or had tried to take their lives, who had tried to die by suicide or some other self-harm, or were very anxiety driven or experiencing depression. And he said, that's not me. I can't be trans. And for years, he was saying, that can't be me. I can't be trans. I don't deserve to transition because I'm happy enough. So he kept just pushing it down and not dealing with it, not accepting himself. Denial. He was great at denial. But then something happened that brought it all to a head. And that's that his big sister got engaged to get married. And one of the first things she did was ask Jeremy to be her maid of honor. And Jeremy was, on the one hand, thrilled. I mean, this is a bond between siblings that was unique, and he felt honored that she had asked him, and he was pleased to say yes. And almost immediately, though, he started thinking about, what does a maid of honor do? His big sister says, let's go shopping for a dress. He hadn't worn a dress in years by this time, but he didn't want to disappoint his big sister. So it was a tough time for him. I'm going to share one more reading. This time I'm going to go grab my glasses so I can see it better. So they went and picked out a dress, and Jeremy again was denying himself, trying not to think about it, not to deal with it. And here's what he said, and you've got a picture again. I'm speaking in his voice, this time as a 23-year-old. I dreaded its arrival for months. When the box came, I'd left it unopened, not wanting to deal with what it contained. I tried to push it out of my mind, tried to ignore how it made my stomach clench with anxiety. I didn't even want to think about the dress inside, let alone look at it. Why had I said yes when my big sister Liz asked me to be her maid of honor? I'd known right away that it felt wrong. But the thought of disappointing Liz kept me awake at night, a rock in the pit of my stomach. Picturing myself wearing the bridesmaid dress was even worse. Finally, 6 weeks before the wedding, I used a kitchen knife to cut the seal on the box and opened it, determined to look at what lay inside. Inhaling deeply and gritting my teeth, I slowly reached for the blue chiffon gown. I pulled it from its packaging and spread it on my bed. All I had to do was try it on. I could do that, I told myself, wincing at the thought. I should do that, but not yet. I'd wait until I got home from school. All day, with every word of every lecture, my mind drifted back to my bedroom, to the dress waiting for me. Arriving home after class, I walked slowly into my bedroom. My pulse racing, I stripped down and slipped the dress over my head. On somebody else, I would have thought it beautiful, no question, but not on me. I cringed at the thought of wearing it in front of everybody. I cringed because that flowing dress was so totally and completely inappropriate for me. It was the exact opposite of what I like, of who I am. I'm not feminine, and I don't want to look that way. My throat tightened as I felt my eyes tear up in frustration. Deciding to face my anxiety head on, I stood in front of my mirror and looked at the person staring back. I shuddered at my reflection, at the tightly fitting bodice that pushed up and magnified my breasts, accentuating every curve. I hunched my shoulders forward, trying to make my shape less noticeable, but it didn't work. My reflection smiled back at me, but it was a sad smile. Leaving the safety of my room, I walked over to where my roommate was sitting in his usual spot in our living room. I raised my arms and spun around, allowing him to take it all in. Seeing the devastation on my face, he finally spoke. "You have to tell her. You're tearing yourself apart." He was right. I couldn't think of anything else. I hate my body. I have ever since puberty, when there was no avoiding that my body was turning into a woman. I'm not supposed to have curves on my hips and breasts. I'm supposed to be flat. I know that. I just have no idea what to say to my big sister. Well, he didn't figure out what to say to his big sister in terms of how he was feeling, but he was brave enough to say to her, "I can't wear the dress." And his big sister, without really understanding why, went along. And together they worked out that he would wear the same slacks as the men in the wedding party. And he wore a dress shirt, a white man's dress shirt, and a vest that matched the color of the bridesmaids. And he stood by his sister's side. And he looked adorable. And everyone in the family and the friends, everybody responded very positively and said he looked adorable. And he told me later, he said, "That's not what I was looking for. I wanted them to say handsome. I so wanted them to say handsome." But we weren't there yet. But right around that same time, he managed to get up the courage to tell the family that he'd been investigating, thinking about top surgery. So top surgery is basically a double mastectomy that a woman who has breast cancer would undergo. And with top surgery, a transgender man has their breasts removed and their shape sculpted to give themselves a more masculine figure. And Jeremy wanted to do that. And he told us, and he told his siblings, and he got it scheduled. And then his big brother got married before the surgery. And his big brother, knowing what had happened at his big sister's wedding, said, "You know what? Don't worry about it. Just wear the same suits as all the guys are wearing and stand by my side. Don't stand on my fiance's side. Stand by me." And that's what he did. That's what acceptance looks like. We still didn't understand why, because Jeremy was still in a state of denial. He said, "If I just fix the way my chest looks, I'll be okay. The dysphoria will go away." And even though all the paperwork that he had to sign said he was having gender reassignment surgery, he said, "Well, that's not why I'm doing it. I'm not a man. I'm not a woman, but I'm not a man." Well, then he had his surgery, and the way it was set up to keep the costs low for so many individuals who didn't have it covered by insurance and had to save and work 2 jobs to save up the money to do this, it was done as outpatient surgery, and then you'd stay in a hotel near the hospital with a family member or a friend who would take care of you. And so he and I met up in Florida, where he picked his surgeon, and I took care of him for the week. And during that week, among the many things we talked about, he said, "Mom, I don't think I'm going to do it, but if I were to say that I'm a man and take a man's name, I don't want a name that would be a current baby name popular today. I want something you and Dad would have picked 23 years ago." And so we talked about it, and I got to name my child a second time. And I didn't even know it, but Jeremy was one of the names that we talked about. It fit in with the other names. It honored our Jewish tradition of being from the Old Testament, but it was a name that was kind of also mainstream America, which honored the rest of the family. So my husband is not Jewish, and he liked the name Jeremy, but in his usual way, he said, "Well, I'll think about it." He didn't tell me he liked it. I didn't find that out until 6 months later when he posted on Facebook. And he put out a new profile picture, and he put in a new name. All the history was there. He didn't erase that, but he put out his new name. And he said, "Hey, everybody, you may have noticed my profile picture is different and my name is different. Please start calling me Jeremy and start using male pronouns." And in a couple of weeks, I'm going to start taking testosterone. And I'm going to go through a male puberty, just like guys do when they're 13, 14 years old. My voice will deepen. Maybe I'll get some facial hair. He really wanted facial hair. And my shoulders will broaden. I'll get stronger. Bye. And that was it. Word was out. Well, I was already a writer at that point, and I sensed that this was coming, and so in my own head, I'd already written a response. So within minutes of seeing his posting, I said to John, do you think it's too soon for me to write? John, my husband, sitting back there, and John knew I was going to do whatever I was going to do anyway, so he said, that's fine. So I posted myself, and I repeated the basic information, and then added how strong Jeremy was, and how proud of him we are, and that he was the bravest person we know, and how much courage he had demonstrated, and that we'd been with him every step of the way and would continue by his side wherever his journey takes him. And I posted that, and it went viral. And I started getting Facebook messages from friends of friends of friends, people I'd never met. And at first they were all very positive, primarily from folks within the LGBTQ community saying, thank you for being an accepting mom. And it felt great. I felt like, okay, I'm doing the mom job just right. And then I started getting some darker messages from young transgender men who identified with Jeremy, but when they'd come out to their parents, they'd been kicked out. They lived on the street. They barely survived. Some of them told me how they had tried to die by suicide. And it was heartbreaking. And I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't just support my own son. I wanted to do more, and John wanted to do more. So we intensified our studies, and we learned that over 40% of transgender teenagers have tried to die by suicide, not just thought of it, but actually tried. We learned that over 40% of the homeless teens in our big cities are homeless because they are somewhere within the LGBTQ community and they've been kicked out by their parents. And we decided we had to do more, and we had to advocate. And we got involved when the city of Houston tried to pass an equal rights ordinance, and the state Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You have to put it up for an election. And so the city of Houston was voting on whether to grant equal rights to people based on sexual orientation and gender identity, among other things, among about 15 items. And there was this huge campaign, and we got involved, phone banking, trying to get the vote out, and we lost. And the reason we lost was because those that didn't want this ordinance figured out that targeting transgender people was going to be a good political technique for getting the vote out against having an equal rights ordinance. Well, that pulled us into advocacy, and we got involved with Equality Texas, and one of the first things they said to us was, we would like to share your family story because people need to see a supportive family. And they came and interviewed us, supposedly to make a 30-second spot, and it ended up being 6 minutes. They ended up staying for hours to talk with John and Jeremy and me, and then they narrowed it down to 6 minutes. And because Jeremy's not here with me tonight so that you can meet him, I thought I'd share that video with you so you can kind of meet him. And Kim, if we're able to now, I'd like to put on that video. So this is put together. Yeah, I'm apologizing. You're going to have to turn to the screen on Audience Right, and we should be seeing it there in a moment. And Equality Texas is a tremendous advocacy group. Almost every state has an organization that's similar, and they do very good work. And I'm on their board, but this isn't intended to be a commercial for Equality Texas. It's just the most convenient way to get Jeremy in front of you. Jeremy now is 32, so this was made when he was 24. It's about 8 years old now, and I think we don't have the volume. Can we turn it up some?
I'm terrified of change. And the only thing I'm almost more scared of is the only thing I'm more scared of is you know, not changing. I'm frozen right now.
Jeremy Ivester is a transgender man.
Today I wanted to talk about gender dynamics. Raising awareness is key.
Who has chronicled his transition over the years with a video diary.
I had too much to say, and I was not very fast at typing. And so I would just record myself.
His mother, Jo Ivester, is writing a book called Once a Girl, Always a Boy, about her son's journey.
I've said to Jeremy, I would like to make your story my next book. Can I have your permission to write about you? Because I think that we can make a difference. Jeremy's journey had been full of joy. It's something that other families need to see. If we can use our personal story as a way of building awareness, that will contribute to acceptance.
The mother and son are writing the book together.
I was already thinking about my own gender identity.
Jo is using Jeremy's video journal as his voice in the book.
He's continued to make his videos.
It was a very jarring transition for me from elementary school to middle school.
Sometimes he just talks about whatever subject he's picked. Sometimes I'll send him an email and say, hey, can you talk about what it was like playing football in middle school?
I was a receiver in flag football.
Or give him some other topic, and sometimes we'll sit down together in front of the computer and I'll interview him.
We'd rollerblade, we would play football in the yard. I was definitely one of the guys, but I would just wish that I would wake up a boy.
It was in middle school where Jeremy noticed he didn't fit in with his peers anymore.
I lost my social group because all the little boys that I had grown up playing with just couldn't handle hanging out with a girl. They didn't know how to treat me. Here I am just so confused because I didn't understand why I couldn't continue to fill this role that I'd filled my entire life. The girls weren't really any better. They were perfectly happy to let me sit with them at lunch, but as soon as they wanted to talk about anything personal, as soon as they wanted to gossip or talk about their bodies, or I don't actually know what they talked about because they would literally send me away. And they'd make me leave because I was too much like a boy, and somehow that meant that I would betray their secrets.
Jeremy, from a very early age, wanted to associate with boys and do boys' things, and we didn't think a lot of that because we were trying to raise a child that was not, you know, that had all options open to the child and not constrained by, you know, gender expectations.
When Jeremy was 18, he had a heart-to-heart talk with his parents, telling them he was not gay or straight. It wasn't until he was about to turn 24 that he realized he was transgender.
It's so ridiculous that at the time I couldn't just say what I was feeling, but I was terrified of disappointing people. And had more people known that transgender was a thing, they would have seen signs and said, hey, you know, if you want to do this, you can do that. And I would have been like, yeah.
The hardest part has been recognizing that we could have given Jeremy more in his adolescence than we did. As open and understanding as we tried to be as parents, we did not have the knowledge, the awareness, the understanding to help him see as a child, as a teenager, who he is. And it's an opportunity lost.
Jeremy really has always been a good person, has always been a righteous person, has always cared about people and wanted to do the right thing. But the happiness was always a little bit of a question. And now he seems very, very comfortable because the source of his unhappiness was just that he was uncomfortable with himself.
I think it's really important to show that transition doesn't have to be this life or death situation. It can be so happy and so joyful and this really positive experience.
At age 27, Jeremy is now embracing his authentic self with confidence and joy.
I can't regret my life. All of it has shaped me to be the person I am, and I think I am more empathetic and more accepting and more loving because of the amount of self-reflection I've had to do to figure out what's going on. I think self-reflection is really powerful. Understanding yourself is really powerful.
The weight that seems to be off of Jeremy's shoulders once he made the decision and went through the transition has been just delightful to watch.
Seeing how joyful Jeremy is now that he can live his life the way he wants to live it, look the way he wants to look, be the man he wants to be. There is so much joy tied to that. That's the best part.
Discrimination is not a Texas value. Embrace dignity and respect for every Texan. Join Equality Texas.
Well, thank you. Are we back on the mic? Can you hear me? Okay. So now you've seen Jeremy in transition. Since that time, he has absolutely flourished. He is so comfortable in who he is. Today, he would not necessarily refer to himself as a transgender man. He would just say, I'm a man. And he sets that aside and expresses being transgender for advocacy purposes because he recognizes how important he is. But it's 5% of who he is. He is a brother, he is an uncle, he is a son. He was a barista, now he takes care of his nieces and nephews as his work. He used to work in a daycare center and now takes that skill and talent to help out the family. He's happy. And people need to see that because that's not the story that we always hear. That's not what our politicians are always talking about. And people deserve to be happy, and they deserve to be respected, and they deserve to be accepted. And that's all possible. And so we, as a family, travel the country and chat with groups whenever we can. We always really welcome the opportunity because our hope is that by hearing our family story, it will enable people to broaden their comfort zones. And it's very hard to hate that which you know. And so we try to give people a chance to know us. And some people are never going to accept, and I realize that, and I will never stop trying, and I will never stop trying to have civilized conversations about the subject. But for folks that just need to learn more, just need to accept the reality of transgender people and that being trans is absolutely real, then we're trying to make that possible. And my ask is very straightforward, and that is for you to think about what level of comfort you have with advocacy work. It can be as simple as if you hear someone make a derogatory comment or make a joke where the whole point of the joke is, ha, this person is trans, that you say something. You say, you know, I don't like that kind of humor. Or I don't like where this conversation is going. I know someone trans, or I know someone who has a trans son or a trans daughter, and please be more respectful. It can be that personal. It can be who you vote for. To seek out politicians who are going to pass bills, pass laws that protect the rights of transgender people. It can be donating money to organizations that are out there fighting this fight every day. It can be volunteering. It can be going to your schools and seeing, do they have policies in place that say we're not going to discriminate based on sexual orientation, based on gender identity? And maybe the policy is there, but the action isn't. Do they have restrooms that all the kids can use and go to the restroom that they feel comfortable with? These are all actions that we can take that make trans youth in particular feel respected and accepted and able to express who they are. And we can fight laws that are being proposed that say that kids are not allowed to say who they are. the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida being the example that's gotten the most attention. So it is an ongoing battle that our family is engaged in, and we welcome all the help that we can get. And just by your being here tonight and learning more about our story, you're already helping tremendously. And when we get home and we're able to tell Jeremy that we were able to speak over the course of the week with hundreds of people who now know who he is and accept him and care about him, that means a lot to him personally. And so you can make a difference, and it really matters that you're here tonight. So we'll do some Q&A now, but I first just wanted to say thank you for inviting us to join your community for this evening. So thank you for that. And are there any questions? I will accept any questions, and even if they seem really personal, so please feel comfortable. Yes, over here.
Just asking a question to get things going.
There we go. I love it.
But how do you approach advocacy in the schools where you get all this pushback about, the idea that if you bring up the possibility to a kid, you could change their, maybe you could actually change their feelings about who they are?
Sure. So the question for our Zoom audience who might not have heard that is, what do you do in the schools when they're trying to say that kids can't talk about who they are because they're, or the teachers can't talk about being trans because that's going to make kids change and be trans. And certainly that is one of the statements that's being made. My own belief is that logic doesn't really help. I have all these logical arguments that I've thought about and worked through, and I'm trained as an engineer. That was my background before I became a writer, and so I'm real happy looking at logical answers, and I can provide them. I can say, we've got all these trans kids out there that keep hearing about straight kids, and it doesn't make them, or all these gay kids out there that keep hearing about straight kids, and it doesn't make them straight. We have all these trans kids who hear about cis kids, with cis being someone who's not trans, that's CIS, and it doesn't make them become cis. So there's a basic fallacy in what is being argued as a reason, even if you were to accept that reason. Another piece of logic that I think about is that you can make a trans kid happy by supporting them. You can make a trans kid miserable by not accepting them, but you can't make a trans kid not be a trans kid. It's who they are. It's who my son is. That logic doesn't help. It's really logical. The idea of respecting everybody and accepting everybody is really logical. But so many of the people who are fighting it aren't paying attention to the logic, which is why, for me, I turn to the family stories, because I think when we make it personal, it becomes harder to just deny. And I will talk to a politician just face to face and say, this bill that you're proposing is hurting my family. And sometimes John and Jeremy and I will walk through the Capitol in Texas, going door to door, and we've done it at the national level as well, and just saying, we want you to see what a family looks like with a transgender family member. These laws are hurting us. And that actually gets through more. And then the response we get is, I get it. I respect your family. I think your kid deserves rights. But my constituents don't understand, and I have to vote the way they want me to. That's even harder to fight, because they're not disagreeing with us, and they're saying their hands are tied. And at that point, I get so proud of John, because he will just say, well, don't you have any morals yourself? Don't you have any ethics that you believe in? And sometimes you need to go out and teach your constituents. And he will stand up for Jeremy in just the most wonderful way. And I don't think we're going to change some of those politicians. I mean, I'm being realistic, but they're staffers, these 20-somethings and 30-somethings that are there doing a lot of the work. They're listening. And they are our future politicians. And so my view is I'm educating them We are educating them. And sometimes they're making things happen that their bosses don't even really know about. They've put stuff into bills that no one's reading, and then we find out that we've got a protection in there after all. Whoa. So that's how I respond. When it's more local at the school district level, I will get more aggressive. So we just lost the battle in our town. We live about 25 miles north of Austin, Texas, in a smaller town, and there was just a election for school board in which a slate of candidates campaigned on saying, "Don't indoctrinate our children." And the term indoctrination has become a code word for saying, don't let there be sex education in the schools, don't talk about the history of slavery, you can't talk about racial relations, you can't talk about being trans, can't talk about having two moms or two dads. That's what they mean by don't indoctrinate our children. And everybody knew that, and they voted for this slate of candidates. And we were clearly very disappointed. We're responding now by trying to organize a chapter of PFLAG, which is a national organization, parents and friends of lesbian and gay people. That was what the acronym stood for initially. Now it's just PFLAG because that acronym wasn't broad enough. It wasn't enough of an umbrella to bring everybody in. But there's a lot of interest, and we're starting with that, and we have our first meeting on June 1st, which is Pride Month. We're kicking it off with that, and we will reach out from there. And by the next election, we won't get caught flat-footed. We will have the votes. We'll be ready. So that was a long answer, but it was a really important question. So thank you for that. There was someone else had a hand up over on this side of the room, I thought. Yes.
My grandson is transgender, and I just want to compliment you for the love that you gave Jeremy. And that's the only way that it's possible to make transgender children happy, is through love and support.
Thank you for that. And again, for Zoom, we just had a grandparent talk about having a trans grandchild and just how important it is to love and accept, and there's no other way. Thank you. Yes.
Tell me doing wonderful work, and Richard Jeremy is as well. I wondered as he speaks to children in middle school and elementary school and share his experiences, so what does he say to them that he wishes he knew at that age?
He does speak to middle schoolers and high schoolers, and they are always intrigued and asking lots of questions. And sometimes John and I will go, and they'd much rather hear from Jeremy because we're old compared to them. But there are a few things he'll say. One is to, well, you heard it in the video. He says that if someone had said to him when he was a little kid, "Are you a boy? Do you want to change your name and pronouns and look the way you feel like you should look?" He would have said, "Yeah," and he would have been so happy. And when kids hear that, they are more likely to accept themselves. Now, by the time that's for the littler kids. At the middle school, it very rapidly turns into questions about school policy. We were at one event where Jeremy was on a panel. We had, we had 3 trans individuals on the panel, and I was moderating as the mom of one of the panelists. And there's all these questions at kind of the 10,000-foot level of what's the theory and, what should be done. And then a kid stood up and said, "Well, that's all good and well, but do you know this school won't let me use the boys' bathroom?" The administrator for the school had previously told me they didn't have any trans kids at the school. This was not the first time this trans boy had said, "I want to use the boys' bathroom." And the school was just in denial. The whole tenor of the discussion changed. And it turns out the school didn't have one trans kid, it had half a dozen trans kids. The numbers are there. It's about 1% of the general population, and we believe it's a higher percent of the kids, just because adults have squelched this, and so don't say I'm trans. When the kids are more open about it and will acknowledge themselves and accept themselves, and so the numbers are looking that it's actually a little bit higher than 1%. But that's where the conversation goes. And then when the kids get real brave, they start saying, well, what happens if I start taking testosterone? And they want to know, how did Jeremy feel? And what were the first physical things that he was aware of? No one expects him to say, I got really hungry. But when you think about the 12, 13, 14-year-old young men that are in your lives, and they started going through puberty, they get really hungry. Well, that's what Jeremy did. He went through puberty. So the kids are really interested in that. They want to know about the shot. Is it a big needle? And they're scared of that, but they don't want to acknowledge that they're scared of that because they want to seem really cool with it. And the questions just get more and more personal, but not in a voyeuristic way at all. They want to know because either they're trans or they have friends who are trans, and they're all talking about it, and they don't have adults that are talking with them. So that's what happens when Jeremy goes out and talks with middle schoolers and high schoolers. And it's so much fun to watch. It's just, you just see these kids open up. And you see the faculty open up. That school then put into their capital campaign that they were going to change their building so that every building had at least one gender-neutral bathroom on every floor. And that's what's possible. Yeah.
I just want to say how remarkable you are in your honesty and your humanity.
Thank you.
You have like a sort of a smiley, jovial way about you, and I can only imagine that there were many junctures along the way when you were burdened, and you talk about how painful it was as the great mother, right? Trying to do the best you can, and you didn't really know early on, right? So you can't really fault yourself for that.
I can't.
But you appear to have really managed this over time. And you're turning that into the best thing in the world, which is advocacy for other kids. And I would say, as you start the B-Flag chapter locally, get candidates to run.
Oh, that's the plan. Yes.
Requiring that, and the Supreme Court was on our side. As we passed this policy, I said to our lawyer, are we on the right side of the law with this? He said, yeah, we're on the right side of this. And so I think that was federal. I think that was in the federal level. That kids have to have access to bathrooms that are in sync with their identity. And we also have bathrooms in middle schools and high schools. I don't think in the elementary level, I'm not sure. To private single stalls, like we see at football stadiums now, other places, family bathrooms. I believe eventually, as districts go through their capital campaigns and they build new buildings and renovate, I think at some point
it will happen.
All of these single stalls, the doors ceiling to floor, and it doesn't matter who's next to you because you're in your own unit.
Yeah.
And I think that's how the architecture is going to be around schools.
I think you're right. I think we're seeing that more and more. And there's been progress and then a pullback. Under Barack Obama, we had an executive decision with a letter to schools all over the country from the Department of Education saying, this is what you have to do. And then under the Trump administration, that letter was taken away because it wasn't law. And now under the Biden administration, it was reissued. So yes, the law is on our side for this right now, but we need to pass the Equality Act as a country. It needs to not be something that's left up to individual judges to make decisions about people's civil rights. They need to it needs to be part of our expectation in our society, and we will move to that. And in our own local town, yes, we're going to get candidates to run for the school board. The individuals that ran that got defeated by this slate that said, don't indoctrinate our kids, they're going to be at our first PFLAG meeting, and they will be, at least one of the three of them will probably be on our board. and one of her campaign workers will be part of the leadership team. So it is going to happen. We know what we have to do. We've only lived in the town for less than a year, so we weren't real aggressive about it to start with. And then we saw this happen and said, time to get our act together and put in place locally what we had already seen the need to do nationally and statewide. So yes, thank you for that very much. And then you had a question.
Going back to, you said you would wish, you said that you wish you knew more. And I was just wondering if you go back and then, I know I think about times when my kids were younger, and oh, I should have done this differently, or I wish this had, have you thought about how things would have been if you lived in a different world?
Oh, sure. If Jeremy, so again, for the Zoom audience, the question was, what would we have done differently if we'd lived in a different world? And we had known. At 4 years old, we would have had, whether it was the preschool teacher or the pediatrician, we would have had someone with experience advising us to say, let's have your kid see a gender-affirming therapist that knows how to ask about this and talk about this and get a kid going. And we would have spent 6 months, maybe 6 years, helping Jeremy to figure out who he is, starting much earlier on. And if at 4 years old he'd wanted to say, my name is Jeremy, I'm a boy, we would have said, yeah, sure. And that's called social transition. And that's really all that gets done with a child is social transition. Despite what you might hear on the political side with comments about parents like me trying to do surgery on 5-year-olds. No parent is trying to do that. It's kind of this bogus, fake straw man argument that's been created to gain political points. So that's social transition, and we would have supported Jeremy doing that. Then as he got close to puberty, again with medical counsel, with a therapist, with an endocrinologist, with a pediatrician, we would have looked at, did Jeremy want to go on puberty blockers? So that's a medication that's totally reversible, and what it does is put a pause in puberty. So he never would have developed breasts, and then he never would have needed surgery. We could have avoided all that. So we would have said at the appropriate time, which is at puberty 10 and level 2, stage 2, we would have said, okay, let's start puberty blockers. That would have given Jeremy more time to figure out who he is. Then somewhere after 2 to 4 years of that, an endocrinologist would have been saying, you know what, we've been on puberty blockers long enough. We've got to make a decision. Either we just come off the blockers and Jeremy would go through a female puberty, or come off the blockers and go on testosterone, and Jeremy can go through a male puberty. In Jeremy's case, he would have chosen a male puberty, and until that point, it would have been totally reversible, because the moment you stop the blockers, you go through the puberty that your body was initially trying to go through. So we would have provided that support. We never would have needed surgery, but he would have gone all the way through school as the boy that he was, and he would have been a whole lot happier. Now, as you heard him say, he wasn't unhappy, but he didn't feel right. He didn't feel right in his body. And for some kids, it's a whole lot worse. I mean, we were so accepting and just letting him play the sports he wanted to play, have the friends he wanted to be friends with, do what he wanted to do, that the dysphoria was not triggered. Now, that doesn't mean that being supportive is going to guarantee that your kid isn't having real trouble dealing with gender dysphoria, because parents can do everything to be supportive and still have their kid have real trouble. We were lucky Jeremy did not. He did not become suicidal. I've talked to parents who, the way they found out their kid is trans, got a suicide letter. And no parent should find out that way. But we would have let Jeremy transition at each step of the way, and I wish we could have done that. Other questions? Yes.
Mentioned
The clergy. Yeah. Okay, clergy has been such a wide reaction. We have found so many clergy members, members of the faith community, pastors, rabbis, that have been incredibly supportive and have helped with education and have been supportive of the entire LGBT community, attending their services, being a part of their congregations in their community, and that's been fantastic. But we also have seen ministers, pastors that have just said, this is forbidden, and you can't be like this, and if you're going to say that you're trans, then you're out of here. And families that have wanted to continue to participate in the religious community have had to find a different one. And for the, we're kind of in Texas, we're kind of in what's called the Bible Belt. And so when folks are kicked out of their religious community, it's devastating for them as families. They've sometimes been in those communities for generations, and they are then excluded, not just from their church community, but from the whole community, because the churches are the whole community in some of these smaller towns throughout more rural Texas. So it's been the full gamut, and I am very proud of the many advocates that work with me side by side who are pastors and rabbis and ministers, and it's been fantastic. And the rest we'll learn. Other questions? Yes.
Comment on transgenders and sports.
Okay, transgender kids and sports. Another topic where logic doesn't necessarily help, and we have to make it personal. But I will give you the logic, because I've spent a lot of time trying to understand. I'll start at kind of the top level. I need to look up whether this was Utah or Nevada, because I keep forgetting which it is. But the State House and State Senate, let's say it was Utah, passed a bill saying that trans youth can't participate in sports, specifically trans girls can't participate in sports, but they had made it more general. When it got to the governor's desk, he and his staff put together an incredible multi-page letter that basically said, when this subject came up, we looked to see who's influenced, because we kept hearing from folks that want this law passed that trans girls are taking over girls' sports, and it's the end of Title IX, and it's all so unfair. And then we hear from trans people and trans advocates that there's not a problem. So we looked for the trans kids that are taking over sports. They found 4 of them in the entire state. 3 of them were trans boys, and no one's really worrying too much about trans boys, kind of saying, well, in general, the assumption is they don't have an unfair advantage, and I'm putting unfair in air quotes because that's kind of the second part of the discussion. They did find one trans girl who was competing in sports and was very talented and doing well. In the governor's letter, he said, for one kid to write a law to make it so that that kid can't compete, to provide what others think of as fair, and exclude every other trans kid in the state from sports, I'm not going to do that. It's more important to be inclusive than to ensure that in this one case, even if this trans girl is a super athlete and winning every medal, it's more important to have sports be inclusive. And that's what went out, and then the veto was overridden. So the state ended up with a law that says trans kids can't play sports. In Texas, we fought the law and we were unsuccessful. So we now have, in Texas, trans girls can't compete. And that's the case in almost 30 states. So it's a big deal. I have a friend who is a trans woman, a bicyclist. She's quite athletic. And she said, you know what? We represent 1% of the population. maybe 0.5% of the population if you want to undercount us. When we're winning more than 0.5% of the trophies, then let's start looking at changing the law. But the way it is now, if one trans person excels in sports, then everyone's in an uproar. And of course, there are going to be trans people that excel in sports because trans girls are girls, and when they're competing in girls' sports, sometimes they're going to be the best one on the team. Most of the time, they're not. And at the college level and the Olympics level, they've actually dealt with this by saying to compete at the elite level, you have to have been on estrogen for at least a year, and your testosterone has to have dropped below a certain level that is lower than the level that many cisgender women already experience. And the advantages start to go away. Muscle mass starts to go away. And the awkwardness that someone feels as their body is changing, if you think about when you were going through puberty, how awkward you sometimes felt, that's what someone who is transitioning feels. So this belief that there's an unfair advantage is just not really proven. And folks talk about it as if it is, but it's really not. You get to the high school level, and you don't have the same kind of requirements because we're not, there's not an expectation that the kids would have been on hormones for at least a year. And nor would I want to have testing in place for kids. You know, I think about cisgender girls. One of the arguments when we talk about logic, one of the arguments that the advocacy community will make is that if you put laws in place that say that trans girls can't compete, it actually ends up hurting cisgender girls. And there are two things involved there. One is that the way these laws are being proposed, it says that if anyone suspects that a girl on the team is transgender, they can complain, and then that girl has to get an examination. And someone, whether it's in the medical community or maybe their coach, is going to have to inspect their genitalia and say, okay, this one can play on the team. We don't want that invasion of privacy. But the other part of that is that the evidence is that we've got 7 million kids playing on trans-affirming teams throughout our country. 7 million. A handful of cases where there's an issue of competition make headlines out of 7 million. So logically, if you really look into it, you would say this sports stuff is bogus, it's a straw man, it's political gain. People don't pay attention to the logic. So it comes back to parents standing up and kids standing up and saying, I want to play sports. I'm a trans girl and I want to play sports. Jeremy can stand up and say, sports meant so much to me. They helped me get through gender dysphoria. That's what I'll say. And we see these 6, 7, 8-year-old trans girls getting up and speaking to the senators and the House members and sharing their story, and they show such courage as they're doing it. And I've seen 1,000 people standing in front of the Texas State Capitol with signs saying, support our trans youth. And we're still not getting through. So we need the Equality Act at the national level, because states like Texas aren't going to do it. And I don't mean to be pessimistic. I'm actually very optimistic, and there's a good reason for that, and that's the kids. Because the adults are sometimes, often, really hard to convince that being trans is real. They fight it, they don't get it, but the kids, they understand. You know, you go into a classroom where there's a trans girl, first half of the kids may not even know, and the half that do know are getting, what's the big deal? The kids are accepting when the adults aren't, and that gives me this huge amount of hope. That's probably a good place to close. I'm guessing that we are already probably over the time that we expected, and I know some of you want to have me sign books. They're on a table out there. Again, thank you so much for inviting us to join you today.
There's donations, there's a table out there with books available, and refreshments. And oh, yeah, because we're a small crowd here to benefit, we don't have to deal with coffee and donuts, we actually have a voting machine. And I thought I failed to mention when I first started making the comments that donate to us courtesy of our relationship with the We're going to do one more question for those of you already chatting. Forgive the intrusion, but their question came through on Zoom that I'm being asked to answer. Kim? Oh, they logged off. You don't want to make volume louder, and that's what my doctor had suggested. Yeah. So I have been using it for a while, but they don't give me loud. So I'm ready for that.